These are the first notes in Mr. O'Keefe's World History class, Ancient Civilizations. So today we'll be talking about innovations of the early river valleys, Greece, and Rome. I like to start out with why we have to learn about this stuff, because it seems like there's no point sometimes, right? Like, well, these people lived a long time ago, they died a long time ago, so what? Well, what I like about history is that it kind of teaches us life lessons sometimes, and the one today that it teaches us is why innovation is so important. And part of innovation is grit, and that means not giving up when you fail. So think about a time that you failed at something. Right? Most people think about riding a bike. Hopefully you can ride a bike. If not, try again. You can probably do it. But no one rides a bike the first time, right? Especially on two wheels. You have to practice. You have to fall a couple times. But eventually you do it. So failure is really just part of the process of doing something new and being successful at something. So if you tried something 9,999 times and failed each time, would you quit? Most people, I guess, maybe would. It really depends on what it is. Well, that happened with a famous invention and a famous inventor, Thomas Edison. Right? He invented the light bulb. It took him over 10,000 tries to get it right. The part that he tried to had to experiment with was the filament, the piece inside the light bulb. He had to figure out which material would last the longest. Some would, burn really bright for a couple minutes, but he wanted something that would last for a long time. And it took him over 10,000 tries to get that right. So you can kind of see how that'd be really frustrating, and maybe you would wonder if anything at all would ever do that. But thanks to him, maybe the room you're in right now is lighted by a light bulb. So it still affects us today. Your screen on your phone, the screen you're looking at right now, maybe wouldn't be possible without the light bulb, right? It's not a light bulb, but we innovated that screen from a light bulb, right? You get the idea that, oh, you can light something up for a long time. Well, how can we make that better? And now you have the lighting that makes viewing this video even possible. He's quoted as saying it didn't fail over 9,000 times, but it just had that many steps. So we can kind of see failure as part of the process, as opposed to you took an L, right? Sometimes we take L's in our life, and it doesn't mean that that's just it and we're losers. It means that that's part of the process. Unless you stop there, then it is the end. But I guess the point of this is it's not the end. Don't make it the end. Make it just part of the process and keep working towards your goal. The road to success is paved in failure. So failure sounds like it's bad. We're used to it being a negative thing, but it's really just a tool that we can use to find success. So we're going to learn about human innovations. And an innovation is basically, it's like the light bulb. This is a good example of one, right? It's an invention. It's a new way of doing something. And what we're going to learn today is that innovations create a change. That's what's really important to know about today's notes. And a lot of these innovations we're going to learn about today are linked to geography. Now, for 99% of history, people didn't really innovate. It's not something you see happen in nature. And really, we try hard not to be this, but we are part of nature, right? We like to separate ourselves from nature, but we're just really animals when it comes down to it. And you don't really see too much innovation from animals, right? Birds have been building their nests for the same way for quite a while. Some animals, of course, do innovate, but for the most part, there's not really much of that going on. But humans, we do innovate a whole lot, but only really we've been innovating for about 1% of our existence, which is kind of crazy to think about. It just goes to show how long human beings have been around that haven't innovated. They really did the same thing for a long time. So nomads are people who travel from place to place to look for food. And that's really just what animals do, right? what you watch a squirrel. What's a squirrel doing? Looking for food. What are bugs doing? Looking for food. Most likely, right? Food, water, shelter, maybe companionship. But really, animals are just trying not to die for the most part. That's what they're doing. Trying not to die. And that's what people did for a long time. Well, we need food, we need water. That's what takes up 100% of the time, right? And sleep, I guess. But it's sleep, find food, find water. And that was their life. That was 99% of humankind's life. Existence was just find food, find water. And now it's not very hard for us, so we have plenty of time to do other things, like watch video notes. So way to remember that is nomads, no home. So no permanent settlements. They're always moving from place to place. Well, how they know where to go? They ended up in places where there's fertile soil, and not really on purpose. They weren't like, let's go find where there's fertile soil, but they followed these animal migrations. And animals have been migrating longer than people really had been around. And the animals know where they would move basically from one place to another. Both of those places having water. Maybe one area would dry up depending on the season, or it'd be too cold and it would freeze. Again, depending on the season. So humans would follow these animal migrations. For one, they're animals, you can eat them. And two, animals would need the same thing as people do, right? Because people, again, are animals technically, they need to drink water and they need to eat food. So the animals basically knew where to go. People would follow them and eat them along the way. And fertile, again, is soil that is rich in substance that plants need to grow. So this area, if you look outside, it's probably green. It means we have fertile soil. Desert, not fertile soil. So how did we change from being nomadic people to being the people we are now? Short answer is farming, innovation of farming. You can kind of see how it works in nature, right? That's why there's patches of strawberries or in the wild, patches of raspberries. There's trees that are the same species that grow together because we know that seeds fall on the ground, they grow into a larger plant, and then they drop seeds, and then those plants grow, so on and so forth. Well, people eventually figured that out. They said, well, what if we plant our own seeds? Then we won't have to go anywhere to find food. We'll just have it right here. And we don't know who the first person who farmed was. We know it's probably a woman, since the way they basically split up their jobs in these nomadic societies is that men would hunt, women would gather food, right? They would gather vegetables, fruits, things like that. So very likely that a woman figured out how to farm and changed us from being nomadic to civilized. So the Neolithic Revolution, if we break this term down, it's an important term. Neolithic is the era in which this happened. Right? Our history is kind of broken into different eras. The Neolithic era is when this revolution took place. And then revolution is a more important term because we hear about revolutions all throughout history. The American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. These things are, all a revolution means is it's a major change. And this change was nomadic to civilized societies. So we don't have to move. We can stay in one place. Why is that important? Well, because it's all about time, really. Now that we don't have to go find food, we can start herding animals, not hurting, herding. Well, we herd them, and then we hurt them to eat them. So I guess it's kind of the same thing. Or we use them for milk or eggs and things like that. But bottom line is we don't have to look around for food. It's going to be kind of right in our communities. So now we have all this time. Well, now what are we going to do with the time? Well, what humans decided to do is innovate. Let's make things better. Let's make our lives easier. Let's make it easier to survive so our children can survive, and that's going to increase human population. So this Neolithic Revolution, this major change allowed for permanent settlements to be established, where we have cities. They start out as a couple huts, and then they grow to be pretty decent-sized cities. And all along, people are innovating. So we see how our theme here, innovations create change. The innovation of farming changed the way that humans live. Everything we have today would not have been here if not for the innovation of farming. So most people would settle in river valleys. So if you've ever seen a river or a creek, it's usually kind of at the bottom of some kind of slope. Maybe it's a really wide slope, maybe it's really narrow. Ever seen pictures of the Grand Canyon? At the bottom of that canyon is a river, because rivers cause erosion and water always goes to the lowest point. Now, what rivers would do, and do all over the world, is they flood in the spring, because usually rivers, they come from a higher area, right? They usually come from mountains or hills where it's colder, and the snow melts and the rivers flood. When the rivers flood, that's basically how the crops and all the plants were given water. So people would settle there and they would farm their plants in areas where the rivers flooded. So rivers also are water, and that's important, and they provide soil for crops. So people would settle in river valleys across the world. Mississippi River Valley in North America, the Niger River Valley in West Africa, all kinds of Amazon River Valley in South America, all had civilizations that lived there. But we're going to talk about the four largest and most innovative river valleys. The first is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq in the Middle East. It's also called the Fertile Crescent because it's in a crescent shape. Crescent shape is like a fingernail moon shape, or just a fingernail, I guess, really. The Greeks called it Mesopotamia. Meso means middle, and Potamia means between the rivers, or I guess the whole word means between the rivers. Excuse me. So that just means land between the rivers, because there's between those two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, is an area of fertile soil in a crescent shape. It goes back to the Fertile Crescent. The Nile River is in Egypt. You know about the Egyptians and the pharaohs and the pyramids. It's the only river that flows north, so fun fact. The Indus River is in India. They had a famous civilization. However, we don't know their language. We just can't. We've never deciphered it, so there's a lot of things that we could learn if we ever had figured that language out. And the Huanghe River in China. Those are the four main river valleys that we'll talk about during these notes. Now, if we go back to the river valleys and the flooding today isn't a good thing, right? You don't want to live by a place where it floods a lot, but back then it was necessary. But going back to innovation, people in ancient times invented some things that would control the flooding. Mainly dams and dikes. Those two things would control the flooding. We know dams are built on a river, perpendicular to a river, to stop the flow of water or to slow it down, and that would control how the rivers went. That would control where the water went. And then dikes, this picture here shows dikes. It's basically making the riverbanks taller so that you could, again, control where the water flooded. Because you wanted the water to flood where your crops were, but you don't want it to flood where, like, your grandma lived. That would be tragic and very sad. So in order to save grandmas and other people, they had these two innovations, and they wanted to make sure the rivers flooded where the crops would be so they could have an efficient harvest. Another innovation is irrigation. So on top of having dikes and dams, they would kind of dig other little trenches to have the water divert to other crops or to other fields. Today we still use irrigation, we use pipes, but in ancient times they would just dig little channels that would have water go to where it needed to for crops. And the more food you have in a civilization, the more people you can support, and the higher your population will be. So there's my definition to dikes and irrigation. Make sure you get all those down. And just as a reminder, if I'm ever too fast, you can always just pause at the video and get that down when it's paused. Okay, we're going to skip through these. So dikes, dams, irrigation, all examples of innovation. And we talked about this already. We're talking about a lot during the notes. So, but here's an actual definition. It's a new idea, device, or method often built on previous knowledge. I might as well put always built on previous knowledge. There's really nothing that we have that's a new idea. There's just better ideas. If you can think of a new idea, you let me know, and I'll probably disprove you because almost everything that we have is built on previous knowledge, built on something else. And that's why it's important to study history. It's like if you build a skyscraper, you can build another floor, but you can't build the floor in the middle of the air. That doesn't make any sense. you need to you need to build it on a foundation. You need to build it on what came before. So that's how history and innovation is too. You can't make a new iPhone without knowing how the last one worked. That would be really hard and impossible. So you always have to kind of understand um, how things are now so that you can innovate off of them in the future. So we talked about the river valleys. We're going to get into ancient Greece, at least the geography here. And of course, geography, we're talking about land. And we're moving ahead a little bit, about 1,000 years from the Neolithic Revolution. And we can see in Greece that geographic features, although they can help, they can also kind of split areas up and divide areas. So in Greece, you have islands, you have mountains, you have rivers that can isolate and split areas up. So even though people that live in Greece were all Greek, obviously, they all had a similar language, they had similar religion, but we'll see in a couple of days how they did have different outlooks on things, different forms of government, different cultures. One thing that Greeks innovated is the flow of water again. So we have, if you have figured this out, I'll spell it out for you. All the innovation we talked about so far had to do with water, dams, dikes, irrigation pipes. Why? Because water is super important. Our bodies are made up of 80% water. So I don't know what the other 20% is, probably cheeseburgers. But for us, 80% of our bodies are water. So we need water to live. It's literally what we are, most of what we are. We're just water balloons, pretty much. So we need to be able to control the water. The better we can control the water, the more healthy we'll be, the more people will survive and make new people, and that's what's going to grow the population. So these aqueducts, as you can see, could move water from a river far areas or to farther areas away. These aqueducts would, well, at least for the Romans, would span mountain ranges and large distances, and it's basically a road for water, but we can control this flow. It's like a water slide kind of, but it's way longer, and you shouldn't ride on them because you wouldn't really be able to. Anyways, so the Romans would have aqueducts that actually were able to provide their city with running water, which of course we have today. Not even everywhere in the world has running water though, but in Rome, in the city of Rome, they did. They had toilets that would run, they had fountains, they had public baths that would circulate water in and out because of these aqueducts. So aqueducts, aqua means water, ducts, like think of like air ducts. Above you, air is flowing through, hopefully nice cold air from the air conditioning, which is another innovation. allowed that so it's allowing water to be transported to different areas. And you could say, isn't that like irrigation? Yeah, they used it for irrigation for sure, but they wouldn't have made aqueducts without irrigation. Remember, that's the whole building part. History is always building, whether it's innovation or political theories or any events, it's always building. All right, so to finish up, I have a couple review questions for you. The first question, who were nomads? Nomads were people who moved from place to place and searched for food. Remember, living very animalistic at this point. Nomads equals no home. How about the Neolithic Revolution? What was that? That was a major change. Remember, a revolution means a major change from nomadic to civilized societies. And that's all brought on by the innovation of farming. Next question, which geographic locations did the first settlements appear in? Remember, geographic, we're talking about land. What kind of land did the first settlements appear in? The answer to that is river valleys. What were some ancient innovations? We talked about dams, dike, irrigation pipes. We talked about aqueducts. We didn't talk about the wheel, but it's one of them. And the activity you're about to do, there's a couple new innovations that we didn't talk about, but doesn't mean you can't still learn about them. So why is innovating important? We talked about innovations create changes. Sometimes they're major changes, sometimes they're little changes. iPhones, facial recognition, does that create a major change? It's not a revolution. It just, you can unlock your phone faster. That's it. But it's still a change, right? And if you're a developer, probably a big change for you because maybe you got a big raise. But either way, innovations do create some kind of change. Also, they often improve efficiency. Think about the crops we talked about in the notes. We went from like, well, hopefully the rivers flood where they did last year. That's where we plant our crops. If not, well, we're all going to die. To, well, we can just make the water go to where we planted the crops with our dikes and dams and irrigation pipes. To, we can plant our crops really anywhere we want because we can just use aqueducts. So you can kind of see how innovations help efficiency. And of course, quality of life, being able to eat and drink and have separate time to do other things are pretty important to people today, and they were back then as well. All right, so the assignment you're about to do, you'll get the directions, but just in case you don't pay attention and you want a recording of this, here we go. So you work with one partner. So the classroom's kind of set up. Hopefully we'll figure out who that partner is. All the answers you come up with, initial, you should get credit for the work you did. That way, if I grade it and only one person initial everything, one person gets credit, the other person gets nothing. That's how I make it fair. So make sure you initial all the answers you come up with. That's going to be something that you just do throughout the year. I know some people don't like working with partners because they have to do all the work, but that kind of solves that problem where if you don't do work, then you don't get credit for doing work. So column A, you have a geographic feature. You have it's mountain ranges or coastlines, so think of like the beach or deserts. One is bronze deposits. In the middle there, you'll see bronze deposits, and now that confuses people. So what a bronze deposit is it's when people find a bunch of ore. So ore is kind of like a rock where ancient people figured out, well, we can take these rocks and we can smelt them, S-M-E-L-T. It's a process where you basically make the rock into metal. You can make metal tools. So you can imagine metal tools are better for war, right? Would you rather get hit with a stick or with a sledgehammer? Right. Plowing, right? If you use the wooden plow, well, it's not going to last very long. You hit a rock and, no, I need a new plow now. That's a pain in the butt. But a metal plow is going to be way better. And bronze is just a type of metal. So think about the advantages and disadvantages for that. That's what we're going to do for columns B and C. What's an advantage? What's a disadvantage? Some are easy to think of advantages and disadvantages. Some are going to be one's easy to think of, the other one's not. But that's why we're working with a partner. This is critical thinking. It's not going to be on the internet or in a book, but it's going to come from your brain. Think about what an advantage and disadvantage of would be for living by one of these geographic features. And then column D, you're going to need a resource for this. This is going to be in the internet or in a book, but it's going to be in that packet that you're given. So you have a list, a timeline really, of all these ancient innovations, and you'll see the reason it's in a timeline is so you can kind of see how they were built off of one another. But the years aren't important. I'll never ask you to give me a year, a kind of quiz or anything like that, because what's the point? Like, if I can't explain to you why you need to know it, then I'm not going to have you know it, I guess. So in column D, you should not be writing years. Do not write years in column D. Write the innovation. Did the sail help with mountain ranges? If you think so, put it in column D. It didn't, but just an example. Which innovation helped with which geographic feature? That's what you're putting for column D. Work with your partner, and then at the end, answer those essential questions. And that's it. If you need help, go ahead and ask for help.